Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Okay. Stop for a moment. And before it fades, look inside you. And look at where you are right now and where you had to move to in yourself and remain there to receive the extraordinary teaching you just received. Notice perhaps that your heart is not in the same place it usually is in. Notice how your attention may have broke for a few minutes in that talk, and then you came back again and recovered it because you knew if you didn't, you would have missed the whole conference. Touch those things and taste them in yourself. And don't let go of them too quickly as we move on now, as we must move on. Because whatever else we're talking about in this conference and whatever else we're doing, that quality that you just tasted in yourself is what we're dancing around. Whether scholars, practitioners, or a bit of both, this is the indefinable essence that can never be captured in anything else but the presence. So I'm going to shorten up a little bit the talk that I was going to give because you'll all read it in paper anyway as soon as the abstracts come out. But I want to again signal the extraordinary character and land-breaking nature of what we're experiencing right now. That we're in the conference, a groundbreaking conference at one of the world's most prestigious universities, acknowledging thereby that Gurdjieff and his work is an area of study worthy of academic response, of true respect, a huge breakthrough in and of itself. And then bringing together some renowned scholars in the profession with practitioners, including some of the most senior formed members of the work, who I have the incredible honor of sitting in between, to talk, to exchange, to try to stretch our languages and different definitions and modes of being to accomplish something that we all sense is being asked of us. And that we know we're prepared in some deep way to give, but it is a stretch. And we watch ourselves being worked on, even as this conference works on us. So we are a living work in progress, caught in the act of what I really want to share a few reflections on in my portion of this panel, which is the whole question of transmission. How is this sacred teaching that we have received from these remarkable people and from higher influences, how is it going to live again in a new generation? And what is our part in the responsibility for the transmission? I want to dance around some of these questions. From the work, from the very beginning, the work has had to navigate the tension between its three cardinal aspirations. The first, to transmit to the world a radically new vision of human purpose and cosmic responsibility. The second, to help people grow their being sufficiently so that they can actually live this vision. And the third, to safeguard the purity of the teaching itself and the accuracy of the transmission. Important because this is a subtle and nuanced teaching of very high voltage, and lesser realizations of it can wind up doing damage. So what kind of organizational structure, what kind of format actually basically serves these three goals that are themselves in creative tension. So I want to mention just for the beginning, and of course this will be well known to you, most everyone in the room, when we talk about that second aspiration, to grow your being enough so that you could live into this vision, it goes without saying that in the work, being and knowledge are not the same. Knowledge is a product of only one center, the intellectual center. A very good center, but not the whole game. Being requires the full harmonious participation of three centers of intelligence, the other two being, of course, the emotional and moving centers. Only when all three centers are online and consciously connected can a state of being be said to exist in a person. And only in a state of being is the giving and receiving of authentic knowledge, objective knowledge, possible. So this is a stipulation of the work, which perhaps is not entirely clear outside the actual lived taste in oneself of the difference between living, being, and knowledge. In other words, it would be blind to simply the intellectual center trying to figure it out. You just got to be there with all three centers. So the other thing that being can do is that I believe, being is not the same thing as charisma, although they can and do overlap. Charisma can be created in and through the first body alone. Being really, for me, is the presence, however fleeting in one, of second body, alive and active in one. And it can be absolutely invisible without any charismatic aspects and still be known, perceived, and change things inside. And it's being, too, that can both state and listen to that thing that Alexander slipped in so quietly last night. The source is very near, which allows us to orient our quest for truth, not toward the past, the once upon a time self, but toward the larger, toward the megalocosmos, from which the source is always emerging. From the future, as we like to say, because we insisted doing it on a timeline in this frame of conference, from the larger, from which we are receiving help, from which people like Gurdjieff are not past, but are actively present personal intelligences, if we can pick them up. So that's what the work has in it. I think to go back to this somewhat pricklish question of transmission and what constitutes legitimacy in transmission in the work, we have to acknowledge point blank that the work has always been a work in progress. The point was made clear in this former talk. Its strength and its continuity has never lain in its outer forms, but in an intrinsic inner intelligence that has allowed it to shapeshift quickly to meet the changing circumstances in which it finds itself. This quality, sometimes referred to in classical studies as metis or shrewdness, is a direct legacy from its founder, G.I. Gurdjieff, and is the work's most powerful, though typically underplayed hand. So let's check that out historically. From the very, very start, Gurdjieff seems to have consciously accepted the terms on which the esoteric knowledge entrusted to him was being offered, that he would be conscripted as apostle to the West, charged with bringing this teaching to a culture alien to his own, in a language or languages not his own, against the backdrop of a world being wrenched apart by the death pangs of the old order and the equally horrendous birth pangs of the new. So Barely had he established his teaching presence in Russia when the outbreak of World War I, followed hard on its heels by the Bolshevik Revolution, displaced him and his small band of followers relentlessly westward to Tbilisi, Constantinople, Berlin, and ultimately to Paris, where they finally set down anchor. And I think we don't realize enough that for the entire 3.5 decades of his apostolic commission, if you want to call it that, he was essentially a stranger in a strange land. His predicament accurately captured in that wonderful, haunting line in Psalm 137, "How do we sing the song of the Lord here in this land of exile?" How indeed. What was needed in this moment, in the next? This experimental gene is seeded right into the nature of the work, and it's important not to forget this. The work did not begin in sequestered drawing rooms. It began on white-knuckle train rides through the war zones, in makeshift refugee camps, in a daring escape through the Caucasus Mountain, and by the way, in the midst of an international pandemic. This is the experimental, in-your-face sort of stuff that the work is made of. And I think that it's that we're going to need to draw on once again, big time today. That we've been through a period of about 70 years now, which for very good reasons, which I won't document here, but they're legitimate reasons. The work has intentionally developed a more veiled presence in the world. Beginning by about the 50s, the work has not advertised itself publicly, preferring to hide behind convenient storefronts like myth and tradition, and to disguise the Gurdjieff Centers with names like the Society for the Study and Research of the Knowledge of Man, high-sounding humanitarian titles in which the G word never appears. And it was a faux pas when I entered the work ever to mention the name Gurdjieff out loud. You sort of alluded to it by what we would nowadays call dog whistles, that those in the know would pick up. So that was the sign of the times. And in those times, of course, Jacob Needleman wrote his iconic Lost Christianity, which is without ever mentioning the name of Gurdjieff, although it's pretty much a straight-up primer in the work. It wasn't done in those days. But today, the times have changed, and they've caught up with the work, that the things that Gurdjieff was first bringing as revolutionary ideas, like a mutually interpenetrating megalopolis, megalocosmos, the whole idea of evolution of consciousness, these have found comfortable niches in our own time. And the biggest single driver, I think, in our present-day Gurdjieffian revival has been the widely popular Enneagram of Personality movement, which we see something that was once cherished by the work, the Enneagram, hold it tight, it jumps ship and becomes a popular thing. You can go get an Enneagram 6 support group if you want. I actually saw one advertising in the paper, but of course the 6s, they need the support, right? And the new culture is hungry for this. There's life. There's that we've finally grown the culture to the point where these things are understandable. So what do we do with this? How do we maintain a subtle teaching in such a way that we still create a wider on-ramp, which is not at the same time a train wreck? And so, without saying more, because it's about my time to shut up here, I would just say that I've postured and still pose what we're doing today. This new convergence of scholarship and work practitioners as a potential third force here. Scholarship can bring what it's always been, open access, rigorous critical discernment, and objective validation within a community of qualified peers. And I think this really begins to bring a necessary reconciling force between this indiscriminate but highly motivated popular thrust of the work, that people are grabbing onto it, and as David Seaman mentioned earlier, irresponsible iterations of it by the people who don't know, because those that do know are too inward focused and too protective of the treasure to share it more widely. There is a responsibility, and we need to find a way that we can create a responsible on-ramp and much wider transmission of the saving being arts of this work that the world has needed more than ever. And with that, over to you, Dr. Lipsey.
Thank you. You know, when we were planning, is the voice okay? When we were planning this great conference with Charles and Gosia, among our own people, Charles was looking forward in a way to sparks, to friction, to the misery of practitioners meeting up with scholars, and never the twain. And we just haven't been culturally productive.
Yeah.
We have time. And there's a little time left. But I do want to say that in listening to Stephen Sutcliffe's discussion of memoirs and that kind of literature, and speaking particularly of René Zuber, I loved that man. He was a mentor. I went to see him in Casablanca with his wife, Lise. We once were at a wedding together in the south of France, standing on an embankment looking down on the bride and groom. And he looked over to me and he said, "Le mariage, c'est la plus dure école."
Yeah.
Which I will translate as, marriage is the most difficult school. So for me, this is not memoir. This is René. I loved him. And others could say much the same thing about other figures who are textually present, and their texts are invaluable. But the living memory is something else. Yeah, so I wanted to mention that as a little bit of fire there. And somehow I feel I have to find another voice. There's something I want to share. And I have no idea if it can be shared. It's a kind of discovery, which is that from a certain perspective, the Gurdjieff teaching is a structure of values. So let me speak about that a little. I'm asking where in the vast body of the Gurdjieff ideas and practices are the values of the teaching to be found? The rigor in its emphasis on ideas and practice, as if the first task is to become a more conscious, inwardly balanced human being who in time will reflect fruitfully about values. Nonetheless, it's true that from the very beginning of participation in the teaching, one is responding to values undeclared, uncharacterized as such, yet they are there, secret lights, quiet sources, and encouragement for striving. A slight shift of perspective eventually reveals that what one initially took to be simply and dauntingly an injunction, work on yourself in this way, along these lines, bears within it a powerful value. It is this slow revelation of the values of the Gurdjieff teaching that I invite you to explore with me. Starting with values, arraying them like a catechism or composite morality for the pupil to ponder, was not and is not Gurdjieff's way. Values, there are so many, lie concealed within the ideas and practices. The first words of teaching that I heard were simple, arresting. We need a new attention and a new relaxation. Everything that followed, introductions to practices of inner work, enrollment in a movements class, learning to listen with clarified receptivity, working with others on projects as large as operating a steamroller to repair a driveway and as delicate as studio crafts. These were the field where the two possibilities, a new attention, a new relaxation, could be explored. I didn't think of them as values. I thought of them as radically new personal projects, the desiderata of a rescued life. You are likely aware of the centrality in the Gurdjieff teaching of the practice of self-observation, and alongside it, deeper still, the invitation to remember oneself. The ancient cornerstone of the teaching is the Delphic injunction, know thyself. The most direct route to self-knowledge, a route strewn with obstacles, lit with hope, is self-observation, but it's not a matter of no sooner said than done. It calls for a years-long, no doubt lifelong exploration. In early group meetings, when our life in the Gurdjieff teaching was just beginning, we were given a helpful key, a simple, direct question to ask ourselves, who is there? It would stop us, call us to awareness, call us to question. At first, the practice of self-observation, of accompanying oneself as one lives, is likely to yield the rough sketch of an identity. As time and practice go on, it may draw closer to being instantaneous, honest, and lucid. One sees more, not from a distance, but from a close position within oneself. And values tumble out of this practice. They make themselves known. The primal value of self-knowledge, the willingness to strive to know with immediacy, the self-respect that surprisingly emerges as one faces oneself, both all the good one has and is, and all the struggles that must not be evaded. Gurdjieff taught what is now called mindfulness a century ago and throughout his years in the West. Though the term mindfulness does not fully capture what he taught, which was to know with one's whole mass, as he sometimes expressed it. The destiny of self-observation is to become that kind of knowing. Self-remembering is another matter. As initially presented in the early years of the teaching in Russia, it is a question of sensing and knowing that one is present. There is not only everything and everyone around one, there is also oneself, recognized. Not as easy as it may sound. There tends to be a blank in every room. It is oneself. However, as the Gurdjieff teaching has evolved through several generations, self-remembering as a practice has acquired other values. To remember is not just to see, not just to record states and changes, impulses and resistance. It is a return to something closer, to the fullness of one's identity, even to the experience of oneself as a child of God, a participant in cosmos. It is, for a moment or longer, to be moved deeply by what one is and what we all are in this vast, multi-storied world. Self-remembering can be understood as the gateway to religious understanding and experience. That is its terrain, mysterious, heartening, limitless, or nearly so. A pair of values is immersed in the practices of self-observation and self-remembering, though I would rather call self-remembering a gift than a practice. That pair of values is the hidden and the shown. Diligent Gurdjieff students tend to become sensitive to these two values. So much is hidden from us. The larger possibilities of human being, no less than the unseen habits and resistance that distance those possibilities and make them seem more than one can hope for. On the other hand, so much is shown, becomes visible and factual as work on oneself continues through years of concern and love. We live between the hidden and the shown, at times longing to be shown what is hidden. It makes for a kind of vividness. It must be apparent to you now that every value in the Gurdjieff teaching is lived as a question, as a basis for striving, exploring, learning. Let's take up a new theme. The values and value structures explicit in Gurdjieff's writings. In the earlier years of participation, there may be little recognition that in point of fact, Gurdjieff's writings present something like a cascade of value statements. One is struck by certain formulations, one explores their practical meaning without necessarily looking at other value statements. For example, among the Gurdjieff aphorisms, there's this: like what it does not like. What could be clearer? Many participants in the teaching take it as direct guidance to challenge subjective preferences, to enlarge the boundary of the acceptable, to scrape against one's pettiness and comfort-seeking ways. What may not be recognized until later in life, perhaps only when one is asked to teach, is that this proposal is situated in a much larger network of values and proposals. It is that larger network I would like to explore very briefly with you now. Certain texts stand out. Among them, Gurdjieff's definition of what he calls the remarkable person, found toward the beginning of his autobiography, Meetings with Remarkable Men. From my point of view, he writes, he can be called a remarkable man who stands out from those around him by the resourcefulness of his mind, and who knows how to be restrained in the manifestations which proceed from his nature, at the same time conducting himself justly and tolerantly toward the weaknesses of others. I often look wonderingly at this definition. Does it set the bar too low? Doesn't remarkableness begin somewhere higher, in more mystical realms? Gurdjieff seems to answer these doubts with a straightforward no. Those men and women are remarkable whose minds are ceaselessly creative and strive to be equal to every circumstance. This is a high enough bar for any of us. Beyond that, Those men and women are remarkable who know themselves sufficiently to govern themselves. They have learned not to burden others with whatever rawness, impulsiveness, or egotism still lives in them, and they have learned to be just and tolerant toward others' weaknesses. There's a concern here for sound relationships, for community, that threads its way through all of Gurdjieff's writings. Call these baseline values, but to my mind, this baseline is in the sky at the level of lifelong challenge. Now, an easily accessible text. The aphorisms were originally a set of painted inscriptions on the walls of the study house at Gurdjieff's Institute near Paris in the years 1922-32. They were written in a novel, flowing alphabet devised by the distinguished artist Alexander de Salzmann Sr. in collaboration with Gurdjieff. The alphabet was known only to the pupils at the Institute. The aphorisms were hidden away, private messages to those willing to learn the alphabet. The aphorisms are a small encyclopedia of values. Remember, you come here having already understood the necessity of struggling with yourself, only with yourself. Therefore, thank everyone who gives you the opportunity. This injunction is incomparably steadying as one makes one's way in community, where differences naturally arise and in some instances can become sharp and lasting. And yet something else is true and needed. The aphorism I'm thinking of reads, "If you have not by nature a critical mind, your staying here is useless." So, we are not to lay down our arms and glowingly accept everything. We must know discerningly, must assess not only other people and circumstances, but also ourselves. Another aphorism from the study house: practice love first on animals. They are more sensitive. In this, there is Gurdjieff's characteristically ironic attitude toward humanity, but also a valid starter kit. That irony, that measured distance from humanity, is a feature of Gurdjieff in the teaching well worth understanding. Among the great teachers and teachings, it strikes me as nearly unique. The closest parallels are the cynic Diogenes and the stoicism of Epictetus. Among the many aphorisms, there is one that speaks to the fundamental aim of the teaching. Here, there are neither Russians nor English, Jews nor Christians, but only those who pursue one aim: to be able to be. An undercurrent of Christian teaching is evident here, as this is Gurdjieff's revision, or better, his renewal, of lines in St. Paul's letter to the Colossians. St. Paul wrote, "Here, there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free, but Christ is all and is in all." In Gurdjieff's recension, the value of what he called being is shown to be central, the center of the center. What is being, as he exemplified and showed the way toward it? And to recall a memorable expression from his major work, Beelzebub's Tales, what is the being of a responsible being? These are the deepest and best waters. Potentially, being is all that one is, awakened. All that one is, no longer constricted by automatisms. All that one is, able to serve the good resourcefully, under the light of liberated conscience. Being is a force in the world. It can be sensed in others as a force. I do not know what being is for those who possess it fully, but the encounter with men and women of being is a reminder, a call. The direct encounter with Gurdjieff and with some of his pupils in later years was of this kind. But the being of a responsible being is not remote. He and she belong here. However remarkable, they are nearby citizens. The title of this brief talk refers to the 18th commandment. What is that commandment? It appears in the Tales, where Beelzebub advocates fiercely against animal sacrifice in ancient civilizations, no doubt speaking also to our need to respect the human body, its untapped potential and legitimate needs. The 18th personal commandment of our common Creator: love everything that breathes. Elsewhere in the chapter, Beelzebub explains that we humans need all species on this planet for our development, as if they are all mirrors and teachers. It's an odd thing, but characteristic, that Gurdjieff doesn't fill in the blank between the 10 biblical commandments and this 18th. Who knows why? Are we to write them as we live? Thank you.
hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.